Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the OIS podcast. I usually introduce it as the OIS Retina podcast because that's the one that I host, but today is a little different. It's more general, and it is the 400th OIS podcast dating back, I guess, 13 or 14 years, I learned. And I am Firas Rahhal. I'm part of Excite Ventures out of New York and part of Retina Vitreous Associates here in Los Angeles. I'm in Los Angeles. Today, my guest is another OIS podcast host who you all know and love, and I sometimes love and sometimes don't love as much. He's what the kids today would call my frenemy. So Rob Rothman, my frenemy, is here, and I want him to introduce himself, and then we're just going to gab a little bit about OIS and the podcast.
Thanks for us. I appreciate that. Just one clarification. I think you're my guest. I don't think I'm your. I think let's just make sure we have the hierarchy straightened out.
This isn't a Retina podcast, so I become not the host. You're the host.
Right. Exactly. Just let's. Okay. I was deferential to your superior status as an OIS podcast host, but okay, let's just make sure we get the boundaries straight. But anyway,
the viewers are getting firsthand evidence of the frenemy comment now. This is exactly where we live.
Exactly. And if this is exciting to you, get ready for 40 more minutes of this. Thanks for us. For most of you who listen to these podcasts know me, my name is Rob Rothman. I'm an ophthalmologist in New York, glaucoma specialist by training, still practicing clinically part-time, and I spend the rest of my time running Infocus Capital Partners, which, like Excite Ventures, is an ophthalmic-focused venture capital fund exclusively investing in ophthalmology. And it is through that relationship that Firas and I have actually gotten to know each other over the last, 7, 8, however many years. And it's also our, I think, common bond when it comes to our interaction with OIS and the podcast series. So just for some historical perspective, Firas and I have participated in, what did we figure out? Was it 66?
66.
66 of the OIS podcasts out of the 400 that have been recorded over the last 14 years. And all of those have occurred really in the last 4 years, I think. Right. So
yeah, since the pandemic is when I started.
Right. So it's been a fairly prolific run of podcasts. And we had a couple of calls prior to undertaking this podcast and tried to figure out exactly what we wanted to talk about, right? I mean, during, why we wanted to host this episode, particularly with each other, and talk to each other. And I think that what we came up with, and I think we'll dive into during the next, few minutes, is how important the OIS podcast series and OIS in general, how important they are to what we do, not only in our clinical lives, but also in our investment lives, and why we think this is such an integral part of the ophthalmology innovation ecosystem. And, it's amazing because as much as we like to beat each other up, for us and there's a long story there, which we may or may not get into, but, and how collaborative we are as investors. This is kind of a unifying bond amongst us and the people with whom we work in our investment lives. And it's also, I think, helped create a very broad community of innovators and industry inside of ophthalmology. And I think OIS is kind of a hub for that. I mean, do you agree with that, Frost? I think totally that summarizes it.
Yeah. And to your point, first in the planning calls, yes, when we did let some of the admin team say one or two words amongst our 20,000, they did agree that maybe the best way to do it is for the two gabaholics to have a conversation. So I'm glad we all agreed to this. And back to the OIS. Yeah, man. I mean, it's so relevant as a meeting. And so the podcast kind of emanates to me from why I think the meeting is great, and the entity, the concept, it extends to us and the podcast, which is that what a great constellation and a unique constellation of these different stakeholders in the ophthalmology innovation world. And so I was making sort of a mental list because I've had this dialogue with people before, and clinicians, scientists, clinician scientists, which is another separate entity from the two as individuals, investors, big pharma, little pharma, startups, the management teams of those startups, the founders of those startups, and many more. And when you hear the talks or when you see the podcasts, a lot of times you're getting the view of all these different stakeholder positions, possibly in one person, such as yourself. And I hate to compliment you, but you can sit
Please
and have
don't.
a dialogue with somebody about corporate development of a startup, clinical development or pre-clinical development of a startup. You can then have a dialogue of how a management team might be built and take it from there on through to commercialization. And I think that's kind of the inherent beauty of OIS. When you go to the meeting or you listen to the podcast, you're getting a conversation often with just one person who can encapsulate the entire process from all fronts. I don't think that happens at any other, at least none of the venues I'm going to. And I go to all the major meetings. It's always individualized. Maybe you go to a business meeting, and maybe you go to a clinical science meeting, or maybe you go to a preclinical science meeting, and they're all of great value. And anyway, that's my thoughts. How about you?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think it's a fantastic forum. I kind of go back to the beginning when, when we launched In Focus, which was, probably a couple years after you guys were around, right? I mean, I remember when I had a meeting with at least Mike and James in New York when we were contemplating this, and tried to figure out if there was a way, and we to work together. And we all realized, well, maybe we should go out and seek additional capital. You seek additional capital, and we could figure out if we were going to be able to work together based on our cultures internally, and it worked out great. And I think we have an amazing, relationship as investors that are like-minded and similarly focused. And I think about how I started to navigate into the investment world, and ultimately was, visiting these OIS meetings and getting more involved. And I think it was really Craig and Maureen and Jackie and the team at OIS that said, hey, you've got a really big mouth and you never shut up. And maybe, I mean, it's literally kind of how it went. So, and they said, maybe, you want to do some of these podcasts. And I was like, that's a great idea. Why is it a great idea? First of all, like you, and I think like most of the people that listen to these things, we're really interested in what's going on, right? Ophthalmology is such a crazy and unique field where the spirit of collaboration and the singular focus on the improvement of outcomes is so universal amongst all the people who are invested here that it's great to sort of dig into that with people and kind of find out how they got to that point, right? So when I was asked to do this, I'm like, I want to talk to these people because for me, it's a learning experience, right? Every single person that I talk to, I'm learning something from. I'm an ophthalmologist, and I became an investor over the past 20 years through a lot of fortunate and serendipitous, happenstantical things that occurred in my life that kind of led me down this path. But I need to learn, and I still need to learn. And every single person that I've spoken to through the last 3.5 years of doing podcasts has taught me something. And I said, well, this is a great opportunity for me to learn. It's also a great opportunity for me to help grow, the reputation of my investment entity, right? And I think both of us have seen the indirect benefits of that by hosting these podcasts. The fact that I love it and I enjoy it and I get educational benefit kind of is like it's a bonus. We are collaborative, and there's a lot of people invest in ophthalmology, but we've developed a relationship over the years. Excite, In Focus, and Visionary have really developed a relationship, right, where we all are helping each other and participating in each other's opportunities. We share information willingly, and we try and propagate the assets that we invest in collaboratively. And we have a couple of shared investments, right? We have a couple of investments that we share because we realize that not only are these promising opportunities that are likely return capital and create value for our investors, but that these are technologies and things that need to get out there and benefit people. That's the commonality in the way we do things. And that's the unique part of how this works. And every one of the people that we've spoken to during these podcasts is similarly focused. For me, the most amazing part of talking to some of these incredible people, who have succeeded in ophthalmology and who have become leaders in the field and started companies and all the amazing accomplishments that these people have had is that when you dive into their past and their history and you ask them how they got started, everybody's got almost the same story. It's like I came into ophthalmology some way and I love it here. And I wanted to stay here, and I used my skills and my talents to grow something meaningful here. And the reward for that is that you get to be on the OIS podcast with me and Firas, which is
the
the
fun
pinnacle of
part.
your career, as far as I can tell.
The fun part is 100% that part to me. When I made some notes about, what's great about OIS podcast, we talked about the logistical, technical, the learning. But for me, the funnest part is understanding what makes these great people we've had on tick, literally.
Exactly.
How did they get here? We'll talk about some of our favorites. I'd like to bring some up, but how did they get here? What were the bumps in the road? What decisions they made at those points to move on to advance their career, their technology, their teaching career. I've had all kinds of people on, and there's some commonalities for sure, but you learn a lot no matter how far you are in your career, hearing how others have navigated their profession. And people like Praveen Dougal come to mind. His story was incredible.
Right.
I didn't know he'd come all the way across the world to get here and do what he did. And a very unique and interesting conversation. There have been so many. We should talk about maybe a couple of our favorites. Do you have a couple of favorites you think of?
Well, I mean, and this is going to sound completely appropriate for me, knowing me, but my favorite podcast was the one where you interviewed me and Ron.
Yeah, I liked it. It was really good.
I mean, not for nothing. I've listened to that podcast, and I thought about a lot of it over the course of time, because the reality is that since I started my investment career, however many years ago, and that led up to the launch of InFocus, no one ever really asked me why I did it or how it happened. Never really got to, and nobody. I mean, it wasn't really relevant to most people. I mean, some
probably
people
didn't even think about it in those
yeah,
formal
right.
terms.
I mean, our investors wanted to hear, how we started the fund and where it came from. And there's a lot of the history of how that happened is important, Ron and I, and how we met and how the relationship started in our investment life before InFocus and how they merged and melded. But the story goes back much farther than that, and how I ended up getting involved in the business of what I do and how I morphed that into a career, and having you ask me the questions from the perspective of you having done it too is what's the amazing part, because exactly how it goes and what questions to ask, and me being able to tell that story and to hear it really put my purpose as an investor into perspective for me. Right. And I think that one of the benefits that we have of doing these podcasts is that we're both ophthalmologists, we're both ophthalmology investors, and we're talking to people who are either ophthalmologists or owners or creators of business or managers and runners of business in ophthalmology who have also had that same path. And so you can compare and contrast the circuitous ways that we all end up at similar places. And to me, that's fascinating. So being able to tell that story to you on that podcast, is kind of, inspiring. And when I run into difficulties, as we've run into, many times throughout the course of our investment life, because we know it is a very nonlinear path to success, I go back and sometimes I listen to that to kind of remind myself, what am I doing here? Because there are times I kind of feel like just not, and like being like, what are we doing? This is torture. And how are we going to navigate this? And my God, how to and where, and where how does success occur and all that stuff. I'm like, let me go back and listen to what what I'm doing. It gives me purpose, and I think God, this is going to make me throw up. But you did a great job of bringing out the important points. Thanks for us.
I appreciate that. And when we did that interview, and knowing a lot of your story anyway, just like you knowing a lot of mine, there is a lot of happenstance, and it was validating to hear you talk about, and Ron, how you guys came to do it, and the comparisons with how Excite came about, and how I sort of by a circuitous route ended up in this space. And I want to carry that forward just a little bit, and I want your opinion on this. I'll make a commentary of my opinion, and I'd like to hear yours. In my travels, and a number of young people who are early in their, say, ophthalmology career, clinical career, residency, early post-residency or post-fellowship, have inquired, and I'm sure they've inquired with you, hey, I like this, what you're doing, this space. How do I get to do this? And my answer has been maybe to them a little disappointing. I've actually said, look, the people who've been best at this that I've met in the last 10 years, and I don't mean just on the investment side, on the product development side, people like Mark Blumenkrantz and Praveen Dougal and others, they all, the unifying thing was they were all, for a good period of time, became masters of their craft first, which was
Right.
be a great ophthalmologist, be a great glaucoma specialist like yourself, or a great retina specialist like Praveen and Mark Blumenkrantz. And then later, after accumulating years of experience and contacts and viewing what products are good and what products are not good in your own hands and in the hands of your colleagues, it almost organically became valuable to make you a great investor or a great product developer or an advisor to pharma companies, things that we have done. And so I don't think it's a direct route. In fact, I think the long tortoise route results in better outcomes. What's your thinking on this?
Well, it's a very serendipitous, question, because just last night I I I had the opportunity to speak at a uh, Manhattan Ioneer and Northwell Health System alumni day, where they got 100 people to show up and asked some of us who had alternate or different pathways after residency get together and come and speak to the residents and people in the community, whatever. And as a result of that, one of the residents, and you know who you are if you're listening to this, asked if he could talk to me about this. And we literally had the conversation last night. And I gave the same answer: was there's no single pathway. But what I told him was his responsibility as a first year, PGY2, first year ophthalmology resident, who listened to my path and speaking about it at this meeting. I said to him, your responsibility is first and foremost to become a good ophthalmologist. Like, you shouldn't worry about necessarily how to pivot out of clinical care into some other field before you learn how to do your craft, because otherwise you look different. Ophthalmology is um, it's a very special field and a very special discipline, if you're asking me, because of some of the collaborative collegial interactions that we have in how we're all sort of unified in our desire to see deserving things become successful. But you can't understand or be a part of that unless people respect you for what you do clinically, if you're going to go through medicine. Otherwise, just stop now and just go get an MBA and become an analyst and go do your thing. You have an MD, people will respect that. But if you want to do it in ophthalmology, I think you get a lot more traction by being an ophthalmologist first and foremost. So I agree with you 100%. And you're right. I mean, I listened to the podcast that you did with Mike and James, and for the record, I wanted to interview Firas, but he flat out refused. I mean, he just wouldn't talk to me on a podcast. So just for the record,
I heard you wouldn't let me say anything.
It's too bad. It's my podcast. And it's there's no path. And again, you listen to. I mean, that's one of the things that I've been asked by some of the people who I've interviewed to give them an outline, and I said, no, I'm not giving you an outline, because we're just going to talk. But here's what I'm going to want to know about you if you want to know, and I want to know how you got here. I want to know what the path was, because I think people find that interesting. And I think if you are a company CEO or founder, and you want to be embraced by the ophthalmology community to some degree, it's going to take not only a great product, but you're going to have to be a good guy, a good girl. And people are going to have to respect you. And I think knowing the path and how you got there is endearing to a lot of people. And it means a lot, right? It means a lot.
I think the path humanizes people when you
It
talk to them,
does.
like we have in these podcasts and like we've done for decades at meetings at the bar in the lobby of the hotel holding the academy or the ASRS, and you get to know somebody sitting next to you who you just met earlier that day. It's humanizing. You feel like a human connection. It does help create bonds, and it ultimately creates tremendous relationships and contacts. Another tip I've given, and if my residents and fellows, if they're listening, they'll remember hearing this 800,000 times when they ask, how do you know all these people? Like, what, everybody we see at a meeting, like, and I said, well, there's one secret to that. There really is one. what is it? And it sounds like I'm going to do something profound. And the answer is stay late and drink. That was always my theory of how I met almost everyone in my life that became a
True.
business associate, is
It's true.
stay late and have a cocktail with somebody, late after things quiet down and you get to know people. And
Yep.
from that came a lot of business relationships. With OIS, this is kind of I'm redirecting a little, but it's related to the podcasts that we've loved, and the meeting, and why the meeting also is unique is there's tremendous candor. We don't have the CME credit pressure of all the disclaimer stuff that you see at all the other meetings. And I think what it's created is tremendous candor. And one of the reasons, and we talked about this offline, that one of my favorite podcasts was Stephen Schwartz, our colleague here in LA, retina doctor, is he's unabridged. He gives you the straight dope every time at a meeting, at the curbside, and on the podium if he's allowed at like an OIS meeting, because we are a little unabridged. There's not as many restrictions. And of course, you and I let it kind of fly anyway, but I think that's kind of the culture of the OIS meeting, and then hence these podcasts, which I think has been attractive to people who visit the meeting.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And I think that when I first started to go to OIS meetings, the content was great, right? You get to hear about new and exciting companies. You get to hear business leaders. You get to hear from strategics. You get to hear from, federal, agencies. You get to hear from everybody. But ultimately, it's networking, right? It's a place and an opportunity to just sit and talk to people and to get to know people. And you're right; those relationships are critical. It seems different to me than other aspects of investing, where the relationship and a trusting understanding of who you're working with and who you're talking to matters significantly, right? It matters a lot, and getting to know people is kind of critical to that process. And how did we figure out that we could work together? Well, we had a lot of meetings where we sat and drank, right? We had a lot of dinners. We got together a lot, and we talked a lot, and we got to understand each other's philosophy. And I think that in the 30 to 40 minutes that we get on these podcasts with people, we try and dive into that to some degree. It's not just about, well, tell me about your science and tell me what you want to do. It's kind of like, give me the gestalt, the overview. What's the thought here? Why is what you're doing important? Not how did it become important? And I think that that's kind of a differentiator. And you're right, it gets that way at the meetings too. The meetings are very, these are the things that matter most. And this is why, if you're interested in investing in ophthalmology or learning about the ophthalmology ecosystem and the ophthalmology community, understanding it in a way that isn't just presentation of regurgitated scientific material forward and backwards, then you're going to get that overall deep sort of connected feeling to what's going on in ophthalmology. And that's something that hasn't been captured anywhere else, because you're right, it is an ability for people to just speak freely about what they want to talk about. And I get it. I think it's a unique thing. And I have friends. I know it's surprising to you, for us, I have friends, but I have friends
I don't believe
in other
it.
disciplines. And when we talk about these things, and I've made some of them listen to some of these podcasts against their will, it involves bondage, but it's fine. They recover. But they they think it's great. And when I talk about what happens at these meetings, they say we don't have that. Right. And although I'm sure this kind of thing exists elsewhere, it's unique. It is a unique culture. It is a unique bond amongst an ecosystem of innovation solely focused on improving eye care. And that to me is fantastic.
So
And
the
I'm proud to be a part of
setter.
it. I mean, not for nothing. I consider it a privilege to be able to do these things. I mean, I'm sure Maureen and Craig and Jackie will attest to the fact that when they send me an email and say, hey, you have any interest in interviewing this guy? The single response that I've given every single time is yes. I will talk to everyone. That is what I say.
Except maybe mine. I don't know.
Well, I
Mine
tried.
got
You were the
lost in
one
the
who
mail.
backed out. You're just afraid. You just didn't want to,
I am a little afraid, to be honest.
as you
The
should be.
all-time record setter for casual, I'm letting it hang out, I'm telling the truth, and I'm not going to be, you know, corralled on a podium with a suit and tie was Cedric Francois, who walked away from my podcast screen live to answer his hotel door for the food that he had delivered during my podcast, and then ate it while we answered questions. All time.
Yeah. Give me 1 second, Firas, because I have room service coming. Give me 1 second.
Please do. Bring me something. Wine.
Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Yes.
Jackie, for the record, I think we should leave this on the broadcast. It's the best part.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Can you bring it in here, please?
We're going to find out if he's a good tipper in the next 30 seconds, folks. And we're gonna poll this lady later. What kind of tip did Dr. Cedric Francois provide for his breakfast?
About that.
Wonderful. Later, as I mentioned a minute ago to Lisa and Jackie, we're gonna poll the lady later and see if you were a good tipper or not. We're gonna find out. I'm gonna challenge you, Rob, to do that on the podium sometime. Just excuse me, I'm gonna go have a bite of my hot dog.
Well, I didn't necessarily eat something, but I've certainly gone a little awry on the podium, I think. I think my most favorite quote was that glaucoma sucks. I think I said that. I think, right? I think I said that at an OIS meeting, but who the hell knows?
I think you did say that.
Yeah, I think I did say that. So no, I think you're right. It's kind of that way. And look, I'm fascinated, by the people that I've spoken to. Like my second podcast guest was Bruce Cassander. And a lot of people in ophthalmology may not know Bruce Cassander, right? Because he's not somebody that shows up all the meetings. He's not running, a company that necessarily everybody is familiar with at the moment. But at the time, Bruce was the head, was heading up the science at IDUNA, and IDUNA was and still is at the forefront, in my opinion, of epigenetics for anti-aging and focused specifically on the eye. And the reason that I wanted Bruce on the podcast was I had finished reading Lifespan by David Sinclair, and David Sinclair was kind of the guy who's at Harvard who is doing all this work, and Life Biosciences, which is the company IDUNA, is part of that, right? And I said, I got to get Bruce on here because this stuff is fascinating. It's fascinating to me, and it's not something that we learn about, right? We don't necessarily learn about this in our training. We don't come across it a lot. It is, in my opinion, one of the forefront areas of the future of medicine. And to have Bruce on there explaining, epigenetic markers and all this stuff that was completely, and I was sitting there taking notes. Like, I'm taking notes on what Bruce is saying during his podcast. I mean, that to me is fascinating. You get to bring people on here who are going to dispense information and expose themselves and what they're doing to an audience, people who I think are similarly, focused on trying to find out what's new and exciting in ophthalmology. That was incredible for me to hear that stuff. And, I plan on having him back at some point to kind of get an update because I want to know. But, those are the kinds of interactions we get to have. And being able to hear that stuff in an environment that's comfortable where, he can kind of say what he wants. And I can ask weird questions like, how could you make another one of me so that I could go play golf and do the dishes at the same time, is something I think the audience wants to know.
With the eye in the unique position it is, and this is, other than the fact we're both ophthalmologists, that it's a great investment area for innovation. With the way it is and the explosion of regenerative medicine, it's come clear to many people the eye in particular is going to be a leader in this area. I mean, it's perfect for the experimentation. It's perfect for the quick feedback on results as opposed to other organs. It seems like it will be endless for a couple more generations of leadership within as a discipline in medicine for new biologic regenerative type medicines and creations. What do you think about the prospects in ophthalmology? You're an investor. Yeah, I'm an investor. You're in this business. How good does it look to you in the short, intermediate, or long term? What do you see as potential hazards in those areas?
Yeah, I mean, look, that's a complicated question with a very long answer, which I'll try and shorten. But the answer is, I think obviously that there's a significant future in that, right? We got to figure out how to manipulate our genome in order to really solve and cure some diseases, right? Because otherwise we're just always backing up against the wall, right? Something bad happens and we've got to try and repair it, slow it down. I mean, it's the entire basic existence of what I do clinically in glaucoma, right? Glaucoma happens and I'm just trying to figure out how to slow it down. That's not productive medicine, in my opinion. So I think we need to figure out ways to do this. I think we've made some significant progress, right? Gene therapy is starting to enter mainstream medicine, and it's incredibly challenging. And even before, developments have made it into the clinical space, we see new developments coming out, new ways to promote, genetic medicine and new technologies for doing these things. I think it's going to be critical. I think the hard part for us is that figuring out how to fund those developments is challenging because the timeline for potential return to investors is long. And it's going to take a collaborative effort from both governmental agencies, foundations, industry, the investment community. I think one of the things, and we've talked about this before, is how do you connect all of the key components of the investment process in ophthalmic development, which goes all the way back to friends and family and foundations and grants, and then consists of early investors like venture style investors, and then larger, venture investors, more PE style, and then regular PE firm. How do you get everybody in line so that there's a cohesive process by which these things can be propagated and whereby there's benefit to all who participate? It's challenging, but it needs to happen. Otherwise, these kinds of advancements, which are going to be required for us to save ourselves in the future, are going to take too long, be too expensive, too fragmented, and it's going to be sort of like a potluck. We'll take one hit out of 100 and hope that it's the right one to succeed. I don't think that's the most productive way of doing it. And I think
have a follow-up question then.
And one of the benefits of the OIS is that I think when you bring all those people together, that maybe that's the start. Maybe we get all these people in the room at the same time, start talking about these things, and then we can start to see some, sort of paradigm shifts in the whole process. And that's kind of what I hope for.
A follow-up question and then a comment, and I love your opinion on both. So the follow-up question is that paradigm you just described with bringing the people together, somehow crystallizing a more, unified system. Is that realistic? And then two, specific to ophthalmology, my personal observation that one of the potential hazards, as opposed to maybe some other specialties, even though I just spoke about some of the great advantages we have, that one of the hazards seems to me that we have too few big strategics that can help and participate. They're great companies. We're friends with all of them. You and I have done business with most of them, if not all of them, both clinically and then later in our venture lives. But there are just not that many options. And so if the innovator and the founder is raising money and then developing something really cool and really great, there's only a couple of groups at strategic level that he can show it to that may have interest. And if they decline, it's really upsetting and disappointing, even if it's a good product, because there in other specialties, there might be 8 or 9 of those strategics who could look at it. What do you think?
Well, this is so aggravating to me that I have to actually give you credit for another thing. What is happening to me? This is terrible. But I remember you saying,
Rob, this is the longest we've ever talked that you couldn't induce an FU Rob from me. And so you almost got it there. You almost got it.
I'm saving up. Don't worry. You've said many times, and it's resonated with me, and I'm going to answer your second question first. And you've made it a point of several of your, discussions being on podiums where I've actually paid attention to you, where you've said that, nature abhors a vacuum. That's your statement, right? You say that a lot, right?
Yeah.
And I think that you're right, that some of the, what I consider is a paucity of strategic involvement in this life cycle is understandable. It's complicated to be a big publicly traded company, right? Where you've got a lot more pressure on you, and it's more difficult to invest sizable sums of money in something that's unproven. I get it. I understand. I'm not naive to that. But I also think that it's putting a lot of pressure on the investment community like us to try and come up with funding to be able to support products, because what's going to happen is a lot of these big strategics are going to end up with serious pipeline gaps that's going to aggravate their investors, right? So I think that there's a little bit of a gap here. Maybe it's capital market situation, maybe it's COVID, maybe it's supply chains, maybe it's whatever you want to say. But the bottom line is that it's got to change. And I think the strategic landscape has to change. And I am very enthusiastic about Thea becoming a bigger part of the ophthalmic ecosystem, of Viatris taking a stance and coming into play, and Dompe, and companies that are understanding of and aware of the potential for significant opportunity inside the ophthalmology space. Okay, so I think that where maybe current strategics have taken a little bit of a pause, others are going to come in and step in. And I think that we'll have the opportunity to have involvement. And and this is not a self-propagation, or I'm not advertising for myself here, but our second fund has a significant investment from a pharmaceutical company, right? Thea is investing in Focus to try and give us some capital to go out there and raise more money so that we can create opportunities that they may want to be a part of when they become opportunities in the future. And that, not that they have any, it's just, they know that we've got to be supported. And I think I would love to see other members of the strategic landscape participate in this type of process where they support venture somehow, however they feel comfortable doing it. So the answer is, you're right, there's a problem, and I think it's been well recognized, and I think that it's going to change because the investors in these large strategics are going to demand that it change. The first part of your question was about whether or not I think it's feasible to create that culture, and the answer is I don't know. That doesn't mean we're not going to try, because I think that the way that we've navigated it so far is inefficient, right? And I think that if we want to become the pressures for controlling costs in healthcare are real. I mean, we see it in our clinics every day, me and you, right? About reducing reimbursement and how hard it is to keep your business going and what it takes to be successful, and the overall cost and how much of our GDP is spent on healthcare is not sustainable. And one of the reasons it's not sustainable is because many companies, when they finally get a product to market, have to recoup the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars that it took to get their product there. And I firmly believe, and I think you believe this because we've talked about it, that there's a much more efficient way to do it. And it's not that we have to, we all need to make money for our investors. We all need to see return on our investment, right? We're not charities. And I've made that statement on the stage as well. And any investor deserves to be rewarded for the risk that they take in supporting the advancement of science for the benefit of humanity. That's true. But if we can confine the process, contain it a little bit more, figure out how to do things more efficiently, and streamline the investment process from beginning to end, that's going to create a significant amount of saved dollars that will filter down into the final product. It has to. So I don't know if it's feasible. I don't think we've taken a real good swing at getting it done, but I think that using OIS as a hub for doing it is where it's going to start. And it's kind of happening a little bit, right? You start to see how industry and venture are starting to work together, and how we integrate with some of the the foundations, right? We have relationships with, let's say, for FFB, right? They've been integral in getting involved early on, and we have some of these relationships. And I think there's this sort of nebula of activity that's kind of swarming without structure in this early universe, and it's going to eventually pan out into something that's better for the whole community. And I'd like to think that it may serve as a template for how everybody does it in healthcare one day. And while that may sound grandiose, I don't think it's unrealistic. And I think that if we continue to put our minds to it, then we can make those kinds of changes that will benefit us. And I think that, again, it's a testament to the importance of what OIS stands for. And if we use this community as a hub for getting that process started, initiated, then it'll be a great success. That's kind of what drives me.
No, I totally agree with that 100%. And in a manner of speaking, drug development, product development, advances in medical science are still too linear. And that's to the point you're making, which is too long, too slow, too plodding, too step by step. It needs to be accelerated by being less linear. And there may be ways to do it. You just mentioned some. whether artificial intelligence comes in and helps us with product development to speed things along, to have more cross-pollination of information. So every single startup doesn't have to reinvent the wheel on every tiny scientific advance, that there's a shared information. I get that there's IP and all that. I don't want to get into the technicalities, but you get what I'm saying. We work with so many startups, and it's frustrating to watch them have to go through the same linear steps that
Right.
have already been done by like 7 other people, because they got to recreate it. It seems illogical.
Right. Well, one of the, I have a lot of favorite podcasts and I've interviewed some amazing people, but one of the more recent ones that I think was really important for me to do was to speak to Malvina, right?
Exactly.
Speaking to Malvina. I mean, Malvina, we know each other from our residencies, right? We go back a long way. And Malvina was my senior resident, and she, was clear that she was going into this role from the time she left residency. And our paths have crossed significantly now as an investor in many companies that go before her. But she really, to her credit, has done an unbelievable job of trying to change some of the way in which the FDA interacts with companies to try and facilitate and speed the process up, right? And I think that the FDA and the government have to be an integral part of this, and maybe should lead the way of trying to help people get things done more efficiently and more expeditiously. You can't sacrifice safety. But you're right. There's ways to use everybody's work collaboratively to help somebody move through the system faster. She's aware of that, and I think that everybody who has come before the FDA under Malvina's reign would agree that it's become a much more collaborative environment in which to try and get your technology moved forward. And kudos to her for doing that. And I think that Wiley had a similar approach, and we'll have to see how it is without him there going forward, and see how the culture develops under new leadership. But the fact is that that's an integral part of the process, right? So it was a great podcast, and it was great to get her to say it. And I know Malvina is going to get involved in the next OIS meeting. And I got a great email for her today. Sorry, Malvina, if you're listening, saying she's got a great idea for something that she wants to do at the OIS meeting in this coming up in this year. And she wanted to know how she could, get her idea out there. And that's the kind of stuff that I think comes out of these podcasts. It's the kind of stuff that I think comes out of these meetings. And it's the reason why I, take time out of my day and my life, as you do, although mine's busier than yours, as we figured out.
We did establish that earlier.
Right. We did establish that I'm more
and
important.
You do know how to set up
you.
a background to your computer, which I don't.
Correct.
So there's that.
Correct. Well, we can list all the ways in which I'm better than you, but that's not useful for this podcast for us. Come on. But I mean, I think the point is we both do this because we understand that the value is significant. Right. It's that's the point. I mean, it's a significant organization, and doing these podcasts is critical to the advancement of the ophthalmology investment ecosystem. And as I've said before, I'm privileged to have been a part of it. And hopefully we'll be able to be on the 800th anniversary episode one day. Although I'm sure you'll always do more podcasts than me because you live to one-up me, which is just fine.
That is a driving force in my life. It's sad for my family that drives me more than anything else. How to beat Rob Rothman. Listen, you and I could go on for hours, and we probably will offline, but I did want to cover like one last little thing to get a take before we close, because we're running out of time. And it was something that some of the team at OIS thought might be worthwhile as a final parting shot, so to speak. And I've done this before on my podcast with some of the guests, and now as hosts we may have a chance to do it. What would you advise like a young person who wants to, we talked about this a little bit earlier today, but who wants to be involved in the business of ophthalmology innovation, whether they're coming from clinical side or business side or whatever, or who just wants to come to the meeting and be an investor? And what are they listening for when they're watching these podium presentations? Do you have any advice?
Well, I think the single biggest piece of advice is probably just to be present, right? You got to show up. You got to take the time. You got to put in the effort to be at meetings, to sit down for a half hour and listen to Firas. You can choose to listen to me or not, but Firas is a little more insightful in his podcast than I am. Listen, my bravado is just masking for my inferiority to you. You know how that works.
That's getting
Listen to the
around.
podcast. Yeah, right. Listen to the podcasts, show up at meetings, pay attention, make relationships, make friends. And, it's kind of funny, industry wants doctors in relationships. And, obviously it's a two-way street and you got to navigate it carefully, right? Because they have self-interests and you have self-interest. But the reality is that you need to make friends with industry. They're going to want you to be involved if you're motivated and interested. So just showing up, participating, going to meetings where industry is present, seeing where innovators are, that's kind of the only way to really do it. I don't know any other way, and I'm sure there are other ways, but it's kind of how I did it. And I'm happy with how my path has been moving forward. I'm not smart enough to know the right answer, but I certainly think that if you make the effort, put in the time to be present where these conversations are going on, that it will help you get a foot in the door. I mean, what do you think? I mean, what have you told people?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And on the broad side of this answer, and then I want to add something quite specific, but on the broad side, I think it's ultimately develop the relationships and the longitudinal relationships, not the just met the guy kind of thing, but you get to know people, again, stay late and drink or go to the OIS meeting and get to know people over many years who you will cross paths with over and over again. In the initial phases, maybe with no business associations individually for each other, but in the long term, these are the people that participate and contribute to your growth and bring you into opportunities that you might like, or you might invest in, or you might join up in with your clinical or research skill. And so, yeah, to your point, I think it always comes back to relationships. That's almost everything. That's even how we become collegial in clinical medicine when you're working with your colleagues, a glaucoma doctor or a general ophthalmologist. I think that collegiality and friendship and long-term understanding does create great opportunities for the individual. And if it creates great opportunities for the individual, it's obviously advancing the aggregate as well. So that I totally agree. And that's one. And I had one little specific piece of advice for people who are coming and looking and thinking about these startups and innovations, because you've sat at these meetings many times like I have, and you see common themes come up. I would advise the doctors slash clinicians when they're advising companies and when they're looking at innovations, that they're too cynical and they think nothing will make it. And if you were trying to get an MD clinician to invest in a product, if they sit down and look at all the potential hazards, because they know how many failures there are in medicine, they'll invest in nothing. And a little healthy cynicism is good, but that's a degree that nothing will ever get done. Then on the flip side, you have, the founders and the innovators, and sometimes they seem like everything will work and every path to development will succeed, which we know is also false. So I think I would advise people find somewhere in the middle where you have enough optimism balancing enough cynicism that you can actually make a wise decision on who to join or who to invest in or who to advise if you're a clinician. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, I would, except when I talk to you, in which I'm always 100% correct. I don't believe that I'm 100% correct ever, right? And I think that thinking everything and is kind of a path to failure, right? I love not being the smartest guy in the room every time I talk to a founder of some company, and I love hearing their enthusiasm. But you're right. I think that taking a leap of faith is part of what we do, right? And when I've spoken to investors and I've spoken to people who try to get into my head a little bit, my reality as an investor is that there's only so much de-risking you can do. You can answer and you can de-risk an investment and an opportunity up to the point it gets into a human being, right? Because when it gets into a human being, you just don't know what's going to happen. And if you think you do and you're 100% certain, then be prepared to be disappointed.
Then
Right.
you have
So
hubris.
yeah, I mean, you need to understand that if it was that easy, everybody would be doing this and we'd all be successful 100% of the time, and that's not the way it is. And you're right. I think that learning how to evaluate opportunities comes from listening to lots of them, right? And that's where participation in these meetings listening to podcasts, I think, gives you an education. I said it at the onset. I mean, the most exciting part of this whole process for me has been that every single one of these podcasts, I learned something. I'm educated every single time. And if I'm getting an education, imagine what somebody who's just trying to get, started in this process is going to learn. So, the answer is, I agree with you. There's a million reasons to say no. But if that's all you focus on, then just be prepared to say no forever. And I kind of think that, it's part of the responsibility that we have and how we do things, right? I mean, this is how we do things. So I think part of what we do is evaluate risk and opportunity. And I think that part of the way that we evaluate, investments, and part of the process that we go through is to listen to these things and learn what are the pinch points, where are the things that are no-goes for us, and where are the things that are absolute no's, and where are the things that are absolutely yeses. But everywhere in between is where all the good stuff is, right? It's really understanding that and listening and being able to filter through it. That really is a skill that takes a lot of exposure in order to be able to hone. And I haven't figured it all out yet, and I hope to at some point. But again, I can't think of a better place to get all that exposure than on these podcasts and at OIS meetings and at every meeting that you go to. I think that you gain a little bit of insight. So
I want to take a second to thank Craig and Maureen and Jackie, one for letting us be podcast hosts and letting us continue this folly, but more, and I hate to admit this, I know I'm opening up a can of worms here, giving me the opportunity to chit chat with you for the last hour, which I hate to admit has been fun and super educational, man. It's fun to work with you, and we'll continue to do so, I'm sure, for a long time.
Yeah, I agree. And again, to the OIS team, Craig, I mean, and Maureen and Jack, you guys do an unbelievable job of putting together, podcasts and meetings, and making sure that things are great for everybody who chooses to participate. It's been a privilege for me to be involved. I look forward to continuing my involvement, with OIS and helping to sort of propagate the significance and of what you do for us. And you may not think that it has that big of an impact, but it truly does. I know for you guys it's a business and a job, but for us it's a critical part for our lives and for the benefit of patients. So thank you for the opportunity. And for us, I know it kind of sucks, but this is a little bit fun. I wasn't hoping I thought it was going to be a little bit meaner. I'm not going to get, so it's just for the benefit of the audience, we should tell them that Insight, in Focus, and Excite, we talk a lot, and I have this ongoing thing where I have a bet with my partner Ron on how long it's going to take me to get Firas to tell me to go, F off. And
what's the record?
My record
is world record?
It's 6 seconds. It's 6 seconds, which is going to be hard to beat.
We wouldn't be able to beat that in a broadcast.
It's going to be hard to beat. Yeah,
do it offline.
I keep thinking of ways. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night and I think I got it, but it hasn't happened yet. But tonight I didn't think that was the right, because this has been it's been a privilege to talk to Firas, who's someone who I admire as an investor and more so as a friend. And yes, it was great to have the opportunity to go through our own little personal stories of how we got here, and to sort of share our sort of similar assessments of why we're doing this and why it's important. So thanks for that.
Thank you, Rob. Feelings mutual. I look forward to continuing. And for the listeners and viewers, try to join us in November in San Diego. This year, it's a little earlier, the weekend before Thanksgiving, I believe, in November for OIS 14. Rob will be there, I'm sure. I'll be there, and we hope everyone comes. It'll be a great meeting. Thanks for listening, everyone.